In a few months, the Scottish nation will have to decide whether to regain its independence from the United Kingdom. Watching me in. He lives in England, he can't vote, don't worry. But in the early hours of New Year's Day 1966, radio in Scotland gained its independence with the launch of Radio Scotland on the former lightship, the Comet. Now, Radio Scotland was a rather different station from the others, with everything from cookery programmes to charity appeals, a live lunchtime music and comedy show that had come over from ITV, and lots of specialist Scottish and Irish music. Today's panel takes us back to the days when things were swinging to you on 242. Your moderator is former Irish pirate DJ Ian Biggar, but first a piece of music that sums it all up. On 242 metres in the media wave band, this is Radio Scotland.
Just for any avoidance of doubt, we're not going to talk about swinging Radio England. We're going to talk about Radio Scotland. Thanks, Tony, for that intro. My name's Ian Biggar, as Tony mentioned. Someone kindly said to me earlier, "You must have been far too young to work in Radio Scotland," and they were right. So I thank them for that. But Radio Scotland was always on at home, and even as a 5 or 6-year-old, I can remember it being there because of my sister, who was 9 years older than me, and she was in the clan and all this stuff. And I think that really planted a seed for me, which obviously developed in later years, and then my interest in radio sort of gathered from there. So it's especially nice to be with these guys today, who were actually involved back then and made it all happen on 242 metres. So if I could introduce them to you, on my far right, someone who was there on Radio Scotland from the very start. He had a variety of functions in the station, from presenter to working in sales to promotions and so on, and then later on went on to a successful career sort of based on what the experience he gained in Radio Scotland. Tony Meehan. Now, when commercial radio, offshore commercial radio, started in the UK in 1964, I mean, obviously, on the whole, we were kind of green. We didn't know a lot about it, so we relied on colleagues from North America and from Australia to come across and tell us what they knew, because they'd been doing it for quite some time before. One such man is sitting to my right here. He was in at the very start with Radio Atlanta and spent some time on Radio Scotland following a stint on Caroline South and Radio Luxembourg. Bryan Vaughan. And another man who was there at the very start of Radio Scotland, who also did some time, if I could call it that, on Radio 270, and spent some time on Radio Antilles in the West Indies, which a lot of offshore colleagues did do during the 1960s. Great to have him here today. Tony and this chap have met up for the first time in almost 50 years. Pete Bowman. So to kick off, really, I'd like just to have a chat around the man who started Radio Scotland, who was Tommy Shields. He was a former employee at Scottish Television. He was also employed by Lord Thompson, who had a grounding in commercial radio, which probably planted a seed for Tommy, and he could see the potential in commercial radio and was intent in making that happen in Scotland. The station was backed by two London businessmen, Alan Carr and Stanley Jackson. But Tommy was the main man. He was based there in Radio Scotland House. So could I ask, Tony, what are your recollections of Tommy and what was your first encounter with him?
Well, my first encounter with Tommy was in a temporary office he had in the centre of Glasgow. This was in sort of September, October 1965. And I'd just come back from the States and was looking for a change of direction. A friend of mine knew Tommy, and Tommy was sort of a guy that if he liked you, you were okay. If he didn't like you, he wouldn't give you the time of day. And I went in to this so-called interview, and he said, so tell me about yourself. I said, well, I'm just back from the States. I've just... He said, do you know a lot about commercial radio? I said, probably I know more about it than anybody else, having listened to it for so long. I said, you got a job. I went, okay. So he was like an instant man. And the job I had was to sell space on the station. But what you didn't realise was that when you sold space, you also had to write the commercial. You then had to produce the commercial, and invariably, if it was going to be taped, you had to do the voiceover. So Tommy, to get back to Tommy, sorry, Tommy was a man. Yeah, if he liked you, you were fine, and if he didn't, he didn't care for you at all. But he was always knee-jerk. So you can go to Tommy and say, "Today is Tuesday," and he'd believe you, even though it was Wednesday. So he whatever was going on in his brain was immediate. It wasn't actually thought out. And so an example was that Tommy drove around in a Rolls Royce, but when the investors came to visit the station, he went round in a Vauxhall Vector. So he was always a little shy. The roller would be put in a parking slot, and he'd go around in the Vauxhall.
Did he run a tight ship, so to speak?
No, he was off his tree. Tommy never knew really what was going on. In fairness, I mean, he was a great guy. Sadly, he died, but he relied on other people, and sometimes it wasn't a good decision.
Right. So he was intent on starting a commercial radio station to serve the people of Scotland. His search for a ship began in the middle of 1965. He commissioned a chap called Harry Spencer, who had been involved in Caroline before that, and also did some work later on for 270. And he found the former Irish lightship, the Comet, which was actually built on the Clyde in 1904. So the Comet was found, and it was fitted out for broadcasting purposes, and eventually arrived off the coast on New Year's Eve, 1965, just in time. Pete, do you remember your first view of the Comet on New Year's Eve?
Yeah, and I wanted to turn straight back again. I must admit, it was an old lightship with no engine. It was in a filthy condition, and I don't even swim. I'm putting myself into this thing. So the first glimpse of it was how tiny it looked. Yeah. So small. But as you looked at the great, huge Radio Caroline, Radio London, or whatever, they seemed enormous to me. So that was my first impression.
I mean, it was anchored in the Forth from what I can recall was quite an exposed anchorage. I mean, Bryan, you were in the Forth, weren't you? Did you find that quite a bumpy ride, so to speak?
It was, in comparison with some of the on the Mi Amigo that I'd worked for a couple of years with Radio Caroline in Atlanta. So it was quite different, and the ship was much smaller than the Mi Amigo, even though the Mi Amigo itself was quite small in comparison with the Frederica, which is the Caroline North. So, and the accommodation was less than perfect, you would say.
Yeah. And Bryan's actually got the distinction of being in the Comet in, I think, 3 different anchorages.
Yes.
So we'll come to that a little bit later on. But just come back to the initial broadcast. So Pete, New Year's Eve, you saw the Comet, you got on board. What did you do then?
I can't remember. This is 48 years ago. No idea.
Make it up, yeah.
We found the accommodation, what Bryan said, is absolutely true. We could not believe it. We thought we were going to have all our cabins separate, and it was all going to be wonderful, but it wasn't anything like that at all.
I mean, I got a note from a chap called Gordon McCallum, who was one of the engineers back at the very start of Radio Scotland, and he well remembered that first evening of trying to get the transmitter to work with some great difficulty. Eventually it did manage on the air with the initial broadcast, and if we could listen to track number 2, please, we can hear some of those.
From 242 meters in your medium wave band, this is Radio Scotland. A very happy New Year to you, wherever you are in Britain, and to all our friends who are in Canada who just joined us.
A very happy New Year, everyone.
And a happy New Year, Scotland. That's Roger Miller, one called England Swings. Well, so does Scotland, for that matter. And talking of Scotland, this is Radio Scotland on 242 meters, where the time right now is 21 minutes after 4 o'clock. And right now, Otis Redding, My Girl. Now listen, we're dedicating this next one to our newscaster, Jack McLaughlin, who got such of the heebie-jeebies or something in his bunk last night. He'll know what we mean as we spit in this one, Spanish Flea. Hey, Jack, if you're listening, it's great to be alive. And Jack's itching for a good night's sleep, believe you me.
Good on you, Josh. That's the way there, boy. You sure that was Josh McCrae, that was. And that says New Year's Day, and I'd like to wish everybody a good New Year. And do you know, this time of the year, it's endemic that every Scotsman has a glass of good whiskey in his hand to toast everybody. You know that? And you know something? Here, come here. I'll tell you something. You know, on this boat, there isn't one stricken drop of Scottish whiskey. All I've got is coffee. Yes. So while I toast you in coffee, have this record by the Seekers.
So, 2 points I want to raise there. First, the comment you made, Pete, about fleas and Jack McLaughlin scratching in his bunk. I did ask Jack about that, and he couldn't remember it. But, Tony, you mentioned fleas.
Yeah. Stuart Henry, who was doing this sort of pseudo-Scots accent about Scotch whisky and all the rest of it in his hand. Stuart was on the boat for about 2 weeks and became violently ill every time, and he was throwing up during all of his broadcasting. But Stuart went around like Richard III, you know, long dark hair, velvet coat, refugee from the Byrds band, etc., etc. But he was never on board, really. But with regards to the fleas, one night or day, a fishing boat capsized alongside, and the captain of the boat sent out, or took these people on board and put them into a cabin. And one of the cabins that was in was Jack's cabin. But what happened was that after they left, the cabin was flea infested. Like so there were you could actually see the fleas flying around this place. They were incredible. So the whole boat had to be decontaminated. Jack actually got the fleas, and he was scritching and like coming out with blisters and everything all over the place. So this is just one story of Radio Scotland and how hygienic and clean and beautiful and comfortable it was. You know, I don't think. But anyway.
And you're talking to Stuart Henry. You were actually Stuart's replacement, weren't you?
Yeah.
Sorry, Brian. You were going to say something there. No. Okay. Sorry. No. So that was the first day. The station was on the air, but it had a problem because it could be heard in Scandinavia. It could be heard in England, Holland, Belgium, but it couldn't be heard in Scotland, which was one of the big problem for when you're trying to sell commercial advertising in Scotland. It was anchored in the Firth of Forth on the east side, so covering Edinburgh and the east coast, but in Glasgow, the main population area, there was no signal. So what do? You can raise the power, but unfortunately the kit on the boat didn't cope that well with turning the transmitter up. Kept blowing up, yeah. So the next option is to move the ship from the east coast round to the west, which was the chosen option. A costly thing to do because obviously being a light ship, the Comet had no engines, so it had to be towed all the way. It was decided, I believe, to broadcast during that tow, and Tony, you were on board.
Yeah. You were allowed, part of the journey you were outside the territorial waters, and other parts of the journey you're inside, so therefore you'll be broadcasting on and off the air. We'll be back in 2 hours. and then 2 hours later you'd come back and you'd broadcast. And it was really a 3-day trip, and it was quite scary because the north of Scotland, you've got the Atlantic coming in, you've got the North Sea coming up, so you have this clash of water called the Pentland Firth, and you were. I mean, we were all, there were only about 4 or 5 of us on board, but I mean, we were sort of quite concerned that we were going to get a really rough ride. What we didn't realise was that in the morning, after we had started to move, like early morning, sort of 5 o'clock in the morning, the boat went on fire. And the engine room had a short, one of the generators, it didn't blow up, but it actually went on fire. And I remember sort of hearing the alarms going in the boat and all the rest of it, wondering what the hell was this, because there was no safety procedure at all. So I got up and went down to where this noise was coming from, and there was smoke billowing out of the engine room. And the captain said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm seeing what you..." "Go away." You're getting in the way of things. And 2 hours later, they got it sorted out, and we were back on. But it was an interesting journey because you had these little incidents that were happening. That you were 1 minute you're broadcasting, then you weren't, then you were, then you weren't. Then you had the fire, then you had the Pentland Firth, and then when you came down the west coast of Scotland, past the Isles of Skye and all that, it was absolutely beautiful. No waves, nothing. It was like glass, and you just sort of towed your way through this. That was great. It was an interesting journey.
Yeah. So the Comet arrived in the Firth of Clyde off the coast of Troon, near the island of Arran. 3 miles off Troon, 3 miles off Arran, but probably 6 miles within territorial waters, where it stayed until they got nicked, so to speak. A summons was...
Sorry, that is an example of Tommy Shields. You know, we have a decision, we'll make a decision, we'll do that, but we won't actually think it through. We won't find out really until it's too late. Sorry.
But did anybody actually realise that was going to be an issue up front? No,
because everybody said 3 miles. They just took literally 3 miles. They didn't figure that the Mulligan Tyre.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
It does make you wonder who actually took this decision in the first place, or who knew about it, or
well,
what research they did, or whatever.
It may well have been, I don't know, maybe it may well have been a knee-jerk reaction because the signal wasn't getting out. We have to do something quickly, so the quickest thing was to move the boat. So arrived off Troon, and that was really where you joined, Bryan, wasn't it?
Yes, not long after.
Yeah.
So that was for me about December 1966.
Yeah.
And so that's my first impression of Radio Scotland, was arriving at Troon, being flown up, because I lived in London, and they flew me and another guy, Mel Howard, as well, because he lived in London. I think it was British Caledonian. It was some
British Eagle.
British Eagle.
Yeah,
British
sorry.
Eagle. I was trying to remember that last night, actually.
Yeah.
And this was organised by the program director, whose name was Bryan Holden.
Yeah.
And he organised the tickets, and we picked them up at British Eagle in it was in Knightsbridge, actually. That's where I remember.
Okay.
So when we arrived at Troon, it was just... I'd never been to Troon, of course. I mean,
it's a lovely place, yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place.
Yeah.
And then we got on the tender, and as my memory, I think, was that the captain of the tender was very much a man who spoke Gaelic. You know what I mean? He wasn't. He was sort of anti-English speaking almost.
That's just how we speak in the west of Scotland, you know.
That's it. So I think, my God, what have I struck here? You know, and then it took us out, and I could see the ship, and then there's this tiny little ship.
Yeah.
And so that was my beginnings of my time at Scotland, anyway.
So the location had changed. Tony, you were working in advertising. Did advertising increase after the move to Troon?
Yes, it did. I mean, because they had the audience. I mean, I by that time I was broadcasting, but the advertising revenue came up.
Yeah.
The revenue came really from 3 different sources. You had national campaigns, because there was a sales agency in London that was bringing in the national campaigns that were on all of the stations. You then had local voiceover commercials that you read live, and then you had some that were recorded in the studios at the Radio Scotland House. There was a clear, significant increase in the number of ads.
And you did do quite a lot of live reads, which we'll hear now. Track 3, please. Could we hear that?
Jack, it is Shannon there, and don't think twice, it's all right. Now, have you thought about it? It's only 14 weeks to Easter, but now is the time to think of a car for spring and summer. At Kleiner Automobiles in Renfrew Street, Glasgow, you will find a wide range of excellent used cars, and all makes of new cars are supplied. You would be very wise to visit Kleiner showrooms now and take advantage of the widest choice at winter prices. Kleiner Automobiles, 100 Renfrew Street, Glasgow C2. Phone number is Douglas 0562. I'll read that again. Telephone number is Glasgow Douglas 0562. All right? Good. Now we have Mr. Matt Monroe and the theme from Exodus.
The master salesman at work. But live reads did cause some issues sometimes, like Cross Marlouf.
Some of you may be aware of Cockney slang, rhyming slang. So you right? Cross. So you got it in one. Glasgow had its own sort of rhyming slang. So a Patrick was a Patrick Kelly, and a Patrick Kelly was a telly. A jam jar was your car, and a Mickey Mouse was your house. And in the 60s, there were pejorative terms for one sexual orientation. Some of them were good, some of them bad. And puff was a generic term for a homosexual male. But the Glasgow slang translated into Cross Maloof. So if he was a Cross Maloof, you knew he was gay, but you didn't know what gay was at that time. Anyway, I got back on board and I had this live read, and it was for the ice rink at Cross Maloof. And this basically was a 30-second read, you know. It took me 3.5 minutes to read it because I just kept corpsing all the way through. And every time in Cross Maloof, I just corpsed. And eventually I just had to take a deep breath and go, think straight. It took, 3.5 minutes to read this bloody commercial, but anyway. Sorry. Thanks, sir.
Don't mention it. Noticed I mentioned the Scottish Daily Express, that grand Scottish newspaper at the time, which described Radio Scotland as a lusty infant of broadcasting piracy, as healthy as a baby buccaneer, as you might reasonably expect to find off the rugged, wrathful coast of East Lothian. And it's proved a point that a commercial radio station spraying a relentless programme of beat music into Scotland's transistors, living rooms, radio sets and car radios can fill the entertainment gap. And that was a question I mentioned last night to you, Tony. I mean, obviously, most of the pirates were broadcasting to London. Was Scotland ready for commercial radio?
Oh, very much so.
Right.
They were ready for a different form of radio, and I think this is the same for the whole of the UK. So there wasn't anything particularly different about that. But the Scottish. Because it was Scottish, it was this pride, it was this is ours. It's not Radio London, it's not Britain Radio, it's not Radio Caroline, it's Radio Scotland, and it's ours. And there was a virtual immediate ownership of the station by the community, and that's what made it work. And it was very powerful. I mean, Marshall McLuhan, in his many books, said that radio is the most dynamic of all forms of communication, because it's up to the listener to translate the images in his mind. Unlike television, where you get an image, you get a story, you get a message, and that's it. Radio allows the listener to do that himself, and that's what happened in Scotland. It didn't matter where you were in socio-economic terms. It didn't matter whether you were rich, whether you were poor, whether you were Jewish, whether you were Irish, whether you were Protestant or whatever, Catholic. It was yours. And this is very similar to what's happening in Scotland today with regards to the vote for independence.
Yeah. So advertising had increased, the signal had got better, but unfortunately, as we mentioned earlier, the ship was in territorial waters. And I did read somewhere that there was a possibility of the Navy actually taking over the Comet, but due to the complicated Scottish laws, that never happened. Now, whether that's just a story or not, I don't know, but apparently that was something that was mooted at the time. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but the station was found guilty and fined, which meant that the ship had to move from the Firth of Clyde. Initially, they hoped back to the Firth of Forth, and that was in March 1967. Bryan, you were involved at that time. That must have been a bit of a downer, you know?
It was quite a downer. In fact, at one point I was off the ship, so I was back in London, and I was waiting to hear what was going to happen. and you didn't hear for a couple of weeks, and then you rang up to find out what was happening, and eventually they decided. I think they started to move towards the east coast, and then eventually ended up at Ballywater in
Northern Ireland.
Yeah, Belfast.
Yeah, I think bad weather hampered them. So it was decided to try an easy option. They anchored off Ballywater in County Down in Northern Ireland, which, if you look at the map, is again quite some distance from the intended listenership. So that didn't last long, and I think I don't know if you remember, Brian. There was problems with the customs. They made life difficult, and it wasn't a good place to be. So it was decided again to move the ship in April back to the Firth of Forth. And you were on board in that move, weren't you?
Absolutely.
And you remember it well.
I remember it well. It was myself and Mel Howard and John Kerr. There were another Australian who was apologised for not being here today. He's a great friend of mine. We've remained in contact for many, many years. Friend of Norman's as well there. But the three of us happened to be on board when they decided to move the ship from the west to the east. And I think it was planned to take about 3 days, from what I remember.
Yeah.
Indeed, it took about 10 days to get there. I was interested to hear your story about the first time it went around the other way. This time, it was an unbelievable journey. Remembering that it was a light ship, so it was being towed by a tug. There was no control on the light ship. We just were there. There was very little supply of food and water, because it was only planned that was to be for about 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
But as we kept on going, we started off and it was fine, from what I remember, and then we went through a place called Tobermory.
Yeah.
And we actually had to shelter there because at that point the storms had come.
Yeah.
And we got off at Tobermory. We weren't allowed to get off, but we got off at Tobermory. Went to the pub. I can remember having a hell of a night at a pub there with the three of us and the local inhabitants. And then eventually we moved out of Tobermory and we went up the west coast of Scotland in very, very severe weather, and then came around the top, Cape Wrath or something it's called, isn't it? Yeah. And around to the top, and you were talking about the Pentland Firth. Mm-hmm. Okay. By that point, we'd been going several days, and then we woke up one morning to find that the tug was no longer there. This is a little disconcerting. Remember, you've got no engine, and no control, and you could see the land. It was pretty serious weather, and what had happened is the tow rope had broken. So the tug had disappeared for some reason, which I don't know why. We couldn't see it anyway. But eventually it came back again, and it got another tow rope, and it sort of went around the Comet and eventually got the rope on board our ship, and we were all very keen to assist at this point.
Yeah.
So there was some crew, and there's the three of us. And we got it fixed, and then finally they managed to start the tow again, but by then it was very, very serious weather, and we ended up sheltering in, I think it was the Pentland Firth, I think it was somewhere at the top of Scotland anyway, for a couple of days while the weather blew itself out. And then eventually we were towed around the top of the east coast, going down, and about Aberdeen we did start to do some broadcasting. That I can remember. I don't think it's formally said that we did, but we did do actually some broadcasting at that point. And eventually we finally arrived at where we're the new anchorage of the East Coast. And this was, I'd been on the ship well over 2 weeks at that point. And I also was married, and I had a very small baby at that point as well. And my wife was ringing up madly from London saying, "Where the hell is he? Where is he? Well, he's disappeared," you know what I mean? So and Bryan Holden was great at that. He was very good at persuading, calming it down. And I was very pleased to get off the ship. But the next morning we started broadcasting, and I used to do breakfast programs, so obviously I started then, and John Kerr did the next program and so forth.
Well, I'm sure it's absolutely coincidental, but you left the station just after that, didn't you?
I did, but not for that reason.
No.
Not for that reason. I had a long-term plan to return to Australia, which I did at Well, I went in June, but I finished at the end of May, I think. And
that was your offshore.
So I had
days,
one more shift on Radio Scotland.
Yeah.
We arrived, then I came back again, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Then you went.
Went back to Sydney.
And we've actually got a clip here of your last programme. Track 8, please.
New York mining disaster 1941 from the Bee Gees on Polydor. They're Australian, and so is the next chap coming on, and so is me. We're all Australian, we're all buddies, I suppose. Very good grammar. That's what they teach you here in old Sydney land. At least some of us, anyway. Some are more intelligent. Like Long John. Complimentary this morning, aren't I? So it's bye-bye time, I guess, for yours truly, Bryan Vaughan. I don't know what I'm going to do now because there's all sorts of people wandering into the studio. So I think we'll just play a little bit of music and organise ourselves. Well, that's the breakfast show for this particular morning. I've enjoyed myself for the last 3 hours, and I hope you have too. And I'd like to remind you to join Bob Spencer tomorrow on the Rooster Call from 6 to 9 on Radio Scotland. So until then, bye for now. Do you know what? Stick and stay with 242 and don't you go away. It's exactly 9 o'clock. On 242 meters in the medium wave band, this is Radio Scotland.
And off you went to Australia.
And off I did, yes.
That was your, yeah. Did you miss the Scottish weather?
No, not basically, no.
Oh, there's a surprise.
But I loved my time in Scotland. I do have a background of an Irish background and also a Scottish background.
Yeah.
So I do when I first came to the UK, I did actually go to Scotland.
So you're a bit of a Celt.
A bit of a Celt, yes, that's right.
Good.
That's right.
Pete, you'd long gone by this time, hadn't you?
I was working in Scarborough to Radio 270 by then.
So
all this is news to me. I didn't know any of
this. All happened while you were away. I mean, what's your abiding memory of Radio Scotland? What's sticks out to you about your days on the Comet?
Well, it's quite exciting, but I thought we were more off the air than on, to be perfectly
in the early days.
Yeah, it really was. It was very strange, and And Tommy Shield, you were talking about before, he was a very strange man. He was supposed to, just exactly like Tony, he was supposed to be interviewing me, but he didn't ask me a single question because he relied on Roger Gale, who was our programme director at the time. He's now Sir Roger Gale, MP, of course. He relied on him to do all the questioning, and of course Roger knew me, so he didn't need to ask me anything. But I think, anyway, I left, I got to about 6 months of Scotland. I was only there 6 months.
Yeah. It was a good experience.
Sorry?
It was a good experience.
It was sort of, you know. I quite enjoyed playing the music. I wasn't interested in all the politics or anything like that, or even the advertising.
Yeah.
But all I wanted to do was play music, and I quite enjoyed it. It was quite a unique experience.
So Brian's gone to Australia, Pete's gone to Radio 270. I don't know where you were, Tony, but by this time I was hoping for Ben Healy to talk us through the last few days, but unfortunately can't be here. But Tony, you were with the station until around about May, June time, weren't you?
Yeah, I left in June. You know, sometimes you wake up and you go, what am I doing here? You know, and it took me a long time to get to that point. The best part of about 15 months, and I thought, am I going to spend the rest of my life just playing records? And I thought, no, I need to do something different. So I came off the ship. I actually left. I was hired by Radio Scotland 3 times. I was fired once, then rehired. I then left and went to Britain Radio. Didn't like that. Came back, got rehired, and then I was put in charge of the road shows. So you had clan balls, they called them. So Radio Scotland clan balls, I ran those for about 4 months, 5 months.
And they were very popular, weren't they?
They were absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Made lots of money for Tommy. Made lots of money. Anyway, and then I left and went to run a discotheque in Dundee, and because it doesn't really help when you're screwing the boss's daughters, so therefore I got fired of that as well. But that's another story. And I came back and went back into advertising as a copywriter, and then into PR. That's it.
I mean, one thing that did happen after the towing episode and moving from the Clyde to Ireland to the Forth, it seems there was a sort of boardroom battle in which several people lost their jobs on Radio Scotland. I asked Tony about this and Jack as well. They couldn't really remember, but Ben Healy does recollect it quite well. Whether they were looking for a scapegoat because they lost a lot of money during the time off the air and the time moving the ship. Bryan Holden, who was probably one of the architects of Radio Scotland from the very start. He was apparently fired by Tommy Shields. Yeah. Bob Spencer, who was senior disc jockey, he left in sympathy. Other people like Alan Mackenzie, the late Alan Mackenzie, left at that time as well, and also disc jockey Eddie White. So there was quite a shuffle of personnel. New guys come in, like Tony Allen, who a lot of people in here will remember. Tony joined the station, as did Mark West. Stevie Merrick was in Radio Scotland for a short time, so I mean there was quite a change in staff by that time. But unfortunately, it was nearing the end for the station, and they had very little time left. The station, as we said, had lost a lot of money, and it was probably a case now of cutting your losses. And I don't know if anybody here remembers, but Tommy came up with a Radio Scotland Listeners Club idea. He wanted people to subscribe, even though the station would be off the air, and have some sort of special offers and raffles and so on. But that didn't really raise a lot of money. And I think he was trying to really do anything he could to keep the station alive. But by that time, obviously things were starting to get serious, and the government were intent on outlawing the offshore stations. So Radio Scotland, the writing was on the wall, and the final day came around, August the 14th, 1967. We have some air checks from that last day, and also Tommy doing his final announcement. So could we have track 12, please?
And at approximately 12 plus 2 on this Monday, the 14th of August, 1967, a sad day in the history of British commercial radio. A very good morning to you for this final Night Owl show. You're with TM in the AM. First record for old time's sake, Memories and Things, Sonny Warner, bell-bottom denim blue jeans.
Great to be back broadcasting on this final week, and in fact closing down the station in more than one ways on our final swing across midday show. And as Mel Hard was saying about Kathy Spence,
next week we won't hear her on station.
Oh, goody! I'm being stared about a pot, yes, give me a pot. I'm being, oh dear, my goodness me, you see the loos up the stairs, yes. Well, anyway, as I was going to say before I was so rudely interrupted, I'm being stared upon by 4 ugly pairs of eyes, which is a surprise. There's only 2 people there. Never mind. Right now, here's a word from our managing director, Mr. Tommy Shields.
Anyway.
Yes, indeed. Oh, lovely boy. Yes, indeed. But right now, for our final 30 minutes of Yakko on Radio Scotland, let's have some golden oldies on the show. Starting with this one, which was really big way back in 1965. The artist on Tony...
Jack McLaughlin there. Copying Pete Bowman according to Tony, your style there, Pete, Copyright.
Pete was very much a Frankie Howard type character, so it was, and that was sort of Jack trying to copy him, and he did it much better. In fact, when he was on Radio Antilles, he was telling me last night, he got an email or a letter for a card from Frankie Howard saying, "We're doing well here, aren't we, dear?"
I thought it was a joke. It actually was. It was very nice of him.
Yeah. So the station was going to close down just before midnight on August the 14th. There was a final clan ball being held in Glasgow. Did you attend that, Tony?
No, it was at Locarno.
You were at Locarno? Oh, yeah. So that was a farewell for Radio Scotland. Coming up to midnight, there was a silence as the voice of Tommy Shields was heard for the last time, and that's track 13, please.
Well, we in Scotland have never accepted defeat lightly in the past. We have been suppressed and oppressed many times in our long and illustrious history, but we have always come back to win. For we are a proud, independent people. We have demanded the retention of Radio Scotland. It has been refused us, but I don't think it will be for long. For we are Scotland the brave. Well, from all of us at Radio Scotland, it's not goodbye, merely au revoir. And from me, my sincere thanks to all of you very wonderful people out there, the people of Scotland, for your wonderful loyalty and support. Only remains now for me to say, in the dying minutes of Radio Scotland, to again thank you from the bottom of my heart, and to say goodbye and God bless you all. Bye-bye.
So that was actually played live at the Clan Ball coming up to midnight. I always thought off air, but apparently not. It was a tape because they couldn't receive the signal in Glasgow to actually broadcast it live. So Tommy was heard on tape, closing the station down. Very sad night for everybody. And that basically was going to be the end of Radio Scotland. Or was it? Not according to Jack McLaughlin, because a plan was being hatched a couple of days later to actually take over the Comet as she entered Methil and take her back out to sea if they could persuade the crew and the tug to do that. And the hope was to be sponsored by religious programming, plugged records and so on, a bit like how Caroline hoped to survive. But unfortunately, it just didn't happen. There was Jack, there was Tony Allen was involved as well, the engineer Bob Donnelly, and that was the plan. I asked Jack, did they have the backing of Mr. Shields? And he said, well, not officially. So, yeah, that was almost the return of Radio Scotland, but not quite. And that's all going to be in Jack's book, Pirate Jock in Southern Waters, which will be coming out sometime in the future. So that's really it. Do we have time for any quick questions? If anybody has come, we don't. Okay, fair enough. I'd like to thank our panellists today, Tony Meehan, Bryan Vaughan, and Pete Bowman. I hope you enjoyed Radio Scotland. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy celebrating 50 years. And thanks very much for attending.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Ian Biggar, and thank you to everybody on the panel. Incidentally, when Radio Scotland ended, it wasn't quite the end of Tony Meehan's career as a broadcaster, because when Radio Clyde opened in Glasgow, Radio Clyde in many ways was a sort of reincarnation of Radio Scotland, although a bit watered down in some respects. But for a little while, Tony appeared on Radio Clyde in the disguise of Simon Moore. And I remember regularly introducing Simon Moore, although usually I got the name wrong. I called him Simon Meehan once, and I called him Tony Moore another time. But it was nice to have him back on the radio. I lived just off the coast, not far from Troon, in a place called Ardrossan. And from my bedroom window, I could actually see the Comet. And every morning I would get up, open the curtains and make sure it was still there. And with a pair of binoculars I could see whether anybody was being sick over the side, but by that time Stuart Henry had left, so they weren't. But the reception of 242 in Ardrossan was pretty good. In fact, it was so good that I could pick it up on a kettle. Now, people mock this story and say you couldn't possibly have got Radio Scotland on a kettle, but I did. And it's a well-known phenomenon that if you've got a very strong RF signal and you've got some kind of detector, it will play. So my kettle in the morning would wake me up with Radio Scotland, which was quite a nice way to wake up. Now, can I remind you, for those of you who didn't hear my announcement earlier, if you are coming to the dinner tonight, we'd like you to pay for your dinner at some point during the day so that there isn't a huge queue of people waiting to pay for dinner at night. So please take your dinner. If you've got a voucher for the dinner, take your voucher to the desk where you came in this morning and pay for your dinner tonight, and that way we'll get everybody into dinner quickly and settled down. Our next session, which begins in 5 minutes' time, is the RNI, the first of the RNI panels. So you have 5 minutes now for a comfort break.